we're going to UV the small and the single window before creating the double window and duplicating all of these windows around the building. Let's go ahead and open up Hypershade, and we have two materials that were imported when we brought in the BSP template. Select them both and delete them. Now I'm going to apply the default Phong material onto all of our geometry in the scene, just to make sure that all of our objects have the same material. While we have everything selected, let's delete history and freeze transformations. I'm going to use my own UV grid checker texture and apply that onto our object in order to tell where texture is stretching and what the textile density is. You can use a function within the UV editor that gives you a checkered pattern to do the same thing, but I like using my own texture because it helps me to visualize better. I've included this texture in the project files, so all you have to do is copy it and paste it into your Maya LT project directory inside source images folder. Let's go ahead and create our UV grid material. Open up Hypershade. I have it on my custom tool shelf, but you can go to Windows, Material Texture Baking Editors, and Hypershade. Create new Phong shader, name it UV grid. Then under Color, click on the checkered icon. When Creating Shading Node menu pops up, click on File. Then right here under Image Name, click on the Icon folder. It will take you directly into the source images folder of your project. Then select the UV grid texture. This texture will now be used in your material. Now let's select the two windows, including the bottom half, and assign the UV grid material. Right click, go all the way down, and choose Assign Existing Material, UV Grid. We don't see it because we need to enable Textured View. You can come up to the Viewport toolbar, click on this icon, or press 6 on the keyboard. And now we can see our UV grid texture. I want to increase the repetition of this texture, so let's jump over to Attribute Editor. You can also press Ctrl A, switch over to UV Grid tab. Under Color, click on this arrow icon, and then click on Place 2D Texture tab. And now we can change our repeat UVs to 2. We can go higher, but we're going to stick with the value of 2 for now. Let's go back to Channel Box. I'm going to switch over to UV Custom Shelf and open up UV Editor. I usually work with these two windows on a second monitor. So instead of using them in the same view, which will clutter up our viewport way too much, I'm going to switch the workspace to UV Editing. And this is what we're going to use for our UVing. First, let's go to Image and disable Image Display, so we don't see our grid texture inside the UV editor. Then go to View and enable Shaded. This will tell us which faces are facing the wrong direction, which will be shown in red, and the right direction, which will be shaded in blue. This way we can tell if we need to flip any of our UVs. Now select both objects and use Automatic Unwrap. Again, most of the functions that I have on my custom tool shelf can be accessed using the drop-down menus. So for Automatic, go to UV and choose Automatic. Now I'm going to select each object separately and move the UVs so the main window and the bottom part of the window are not overlapping. Now if we get closer, you can see that the textile density is not the same, meaning that the UV grid doesn't match for the main window and the bottom window. So we need to fix that. And we will be doing this a lot because maintaining the same textile density across the entire object is very important, with the exception of the parts that the player is not going to see, which will be the interior space behind the windows and the roof. In order to set the same textile density across multiple objects, select the UVs of the object you want your textile density to be. Then go under Transform, scroll down to Textile Density, and click Get. This will give you a number, and this value is the textile density of the selected UVs. Then select the UVs of the object you want to transfer the same textile density to, and click Set. Now the UVs for both objects, their textile density will be the same. With that done, let's go ahead and lay out the UVs. All we're going to do here is select each UV shell and begin to orient it and place it in a way that makes sense for us to texture later. We're going to select some of the UV shells and rotate them 90 degrees so they are oriented properly, and by looking at the UV grid, we know which way they need to orient. We're going to do this for all the shells that are faced sideways or upside down. I'm also selecting the second object, the bottom part of the window, and positioning the glass so the top glass is above, the bottom glass is below. Same goes for the inner UV frame shells. Gonna put them on the side next to the main front window shell. So again, when we texture, I know which UV shell belongs to a certain part of the object. The automatic unwrap did a very good job, and for this specific mesh, there isn't much of edge zone we need to do. And this process of laying out your UVs is very straightforward. You just need to make sure that you properly orient the UV shells so they're not sideways or upside down, and position these UV shells where you will remember and know what each shell is and where it belongs to. There are quite a few UV shells that we can overlap, so they take up the same UV space. Many of these spaces are on the inner and outer part of the window frame. So select the UV shells you want to overlap, go to Arrange and Layout, and click on Stack Shells. Repeat this for all the UV shells that you want to overlap. So I'm just going to go through and stack the shells that I need to overlap and arrange them within my UV layout. I'm going to repeat the same steps we just did for the other window. I'm also going to position the UVs for this window next to the main window. So I've sped up this part by a lot, and all we're doing is the exact same thing. We're making sure that we are rotating the shells so they're not sideways or upside down, and positioning these UV shells so they make sense. And it's not that you shouldn't orient your shells sideways or upside down. You absolutely can. It's just that early in this stage we don't have the entire object UV'd. And when we get to that part, then we might have to turn some shells around so they fit within the entire layout. Next, make sure both objects are selected. Switch over to UV component mode and scale down the UVs so they don't take up as much UV space. Also, we need to move these UVs outside 0 to 1 space. Here off to the side. This is where we're going to store them until we are ready to lay everything out when we have everything UV'd. Now we need to do exact same thing to the small window. Select both objects, the main frame and the bottom part, and let's automatic unwrap. We need to set the same textile density that we have for the single window. But because we've scaled our single window down, that textile density has changed. So we need to go back to that window, select the UVs, and get the current textile density. Then come back to the small window, select all the UVs, and click Set. Now all of these objects have the same exact textile density. And now we need to go through and do exact same steps. Select the UV shells, rotate them to orient them correctly, stack UV shells that you want to overlap, and position the UV shells around in a way that makes sense for you to texture later, so you know where each UV shell goes and where it belongs. Then let's position the small window UVs next to the single window UVs, and we're gonna move them off a little further out. We are now done with the window UVs, and we can now duplicate and create our double window. One last final step, let's switch back to Classic Workspace.